I'm Adam Seagrave. I'm the Associate Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, scetl, as I've heard some of you using the acronym, which is great to hear that that's catching on. So it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. Yascha Mounk is an Associate Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, a contributing editor at The Atlantic, a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and the host of the Good Fight podcast, which I was listening to on my way in this morning. He's also the author of 3 books, which have been translated into 10 languages, including, most immediately relevant for our purposes, our topic here today, a 2018 book entitled The People versus Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. The title of his talk this evening is The Decline of Democracy, Standing Up for Liberal Democratic Values. Please join me in welcoming Yascha Mounk.
Thank you so much for having me here. I grew up in Germany and Munich and a bunch of other cities, but my parents are originally from Poland. And when I was a kid, I remember them sitting around the kitchen table telling these jokes and these stories about Poland in the 1950s and 1960s. And I didn't get any of those jokes. I didn't get them because my knowledge of sort of obscure political figures in Poland in the 1960s is rather limited. And I also didn't get them because I grew up in a free society, in a liberal democracy. And so I didn't intuitively understand some of the sense of sort of hopelessness and fear that those jokes turned on. But there's one joke in particular that I do recall quite vividly, and it's pretty easy to understand, I promise, so I want to share it with you today. I've been thinking a lot about it in the last couple of years. So it's late at night, and a man is walking home from his factory. It's a long walk, it's bitterly cold, he's nearly back at his own apartment, when off in the distance he sees another guy, visibly completely drunk, throwing up into the gutter. And as soon as he sees the guy, he puts a huge smile on his face, he walks over to him, he pats his shoulder, and he says, "I completely agree with your political analysis, comrade." So you can imagine why that joke has been going around my head for the last 2 or 3 years. There's something interesting going on in the world. A bunch of the certainties that we had, a bunch of the assumptions that we had about the world for a long time seem to be being called in doubt every day at the moment. I did my PhD in political science at Harvard not so long ago, and one of the things that I was taught in a big field survey of comparative politics is that democracy is quite fragile in many parts of the world, that it's hard to achieve. But we shouldn't be surprised when certain authoritarian countries remain autocratic even once they're relatively affluent. That China and Saudi Arabia are still dictatorships today is not a surprise to political scientists. We also learned that democracy in many less affluent countries that don't have deep, long democratic histories remains fragile for a relatively long time. So political scientists are saddened by the democratic erosion we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years in countries from Kenya to Thailand. That, again, wouldn't be surprising to them. But we also learned that there's a set of countries in the world, a set of countries that have changed government for free and fair elections at least 2 times, that have a longer democratic tradition, countries that have a GDP per capita of at least $14,000 in today's terms, countries that are relatively affluent. And in those countries, I was taught democracy is consolidated. And because democratic consolidation was supposed to be a one-way street, that means that we really weren't supposed to worry about the democratic system in those countries. Everybody in those countries was meant to give a lot of importance to living in a democracy. People were supposed to reject autocratic alternatives to democracy out of hand. And most importantly, there weren't supposed to be any political parties and any politicians with real power who actually undermine basic democratic rules and norms. Well, I think this is the disorienting thing about the last 2 years, that is no longer obviously true. In some of my research, I showed before 2016, before some of this stuff became a little bit more obvious, that a lot of people are deeply dissatisfied with their democratic system. According to a poll that was published just a few weeks ago, over half of people living in democracies globally now are deeply dissatisfied with the working of their democratic systems. They don't just dislike this or that politician, they're saying the system itself is not working very well. In that same study with my colleague Roberto Foro, we showed that the number of people who are open to autocratic alternatives to democracy is also rising. In Germany, in France, in the United Kingdom, for example, the number of people who say that they'd like to have a strong ruler who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections has roughly doubled over the last 20 years. It's now 1 in 2 in Britain and France. But the most important sign of this, in my mind, is the rise of political forces, of parties, of politicians that actually undermine democratic rules and norms. And the way that I think about them is as authoritarian populists. Now, this term populism is used in all kinds of bizarre ways, and that's true of many political terms, by the way. But it's important to get to the bottom of what I mean by populist and why I think that there's something important in this political category. Now, some of the people who we call populists don't seem to have very much in common with each other at all. When you look at Donald Trump and Recep Erdogan, Viktor Orban and Jair Bolsonaro, Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales, they don't have any particularly obvious commonalities. To pick out just one dimension, Donald Trump, our president, does not appear to be, let's say, overly fond of Muslims. Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, does not appear to be overly fond of anybody who's not a Muslim. So we don't have that in common. There are some populists who are on the right on economic questions, who want to cut taxation, cut the welfare state, make it easier for big corporations to do business. There's other populists like Chavez and Morales who say that they hate corporations and they want to increase taxation and expand the welfare state and perhaps even nationalize some companies. So they don't see eye to eye on business. So it would be easy to say, well, they don't have enough in common for this to be a coherent category. Well, I think we start to understand what they have in common when we don't look at who the particular group is that they hate, or even what their economic ideology is, but rather at how they think about politics, how they talk about politics, what the basic conception of a political world looks like. And the thing that they all have in common is a strikingly similar narrative. They all say, look, the only real reason why we have political problems today is that the elite is corrupt and self-serving, that they care more about various outsiders or minorities than they care about quote-unquote real people like you and me. And so what we need to do is for somebody who truly speaks for the people to come in, sweep aside all these people who are in power at the moment, and that'll fix everything. Now, part of that is a normal political narrative. Every politician says, if they're in the opposition at least, they say, hey, the government isn't doing a great job. I speak for more people. I can do a much better job representing ordinary people, so vote for me and things will get better. I mean, that's a pretty standard narrative in a democracy if you're trying to get elected. But what populists do is that they make an exclusive claim to moral representation by the people, which is to say that they say, I and I alone speak for the people. So when somebody disagrees with me, they are not just people with a different opinion. They're not just going to do a less good job in government than I would. They are, by virtue of that fact, illegitimate. You know, I can't help but think of one particular example of this here in Arizona, which is that in 2008, when John McCain was running against Barack Obama, a few days before the election at a town hall event, somebody in the audience said, Barack Obama is a Muslim and he's a dangerous man. I'm afraid what's going to happen to this country if he becomes president. And Senator McCain, to his great honor, said, I have deep disagreements with Barack Obama. I have a very different ideology. I think I would do a much better job as president, but he's an honorable man, and nobody has to be scared of him being president of his country. And that precisely is to honor the distinction between I would do a better job, I think you should vote for me, and I alone would do a good job. I alone am a legitimate representative of a people, and if you disagree with me, then you're illegitimate. Now, you can see the consequences that this kind of rhetoric has in the way that populists end up governing. And to understand why that's so important, we need to take a step back and think about the nature of our political system, what our political system is actually trying to accomplish. Now, in the title of my talk, I express this in the way political scientists tend to as liberal democratic values, the values of liberal democracy. Sometimes people in the United States tend to put this more in terms of a democratic republic. But whichever way you express it, it refers to the same set of ideas. It's not about being liberal in the sense of being left or right, Democrat or Republican, Obama or George W. Bush. It is about being liberal in the sense of caring for individual rights, caring for the rule of law, caring for the idea that we want to live in a political system in which I alone decide what to say or not to say, which God to worship or whether to worship a God at all, who to have over for dinner or who to have stay over after dinner. And in order to realize that, we need to have the protection of individual and minority rights. And of course, we also need to have the rule of law and the separation of powers. Because if there's a president or a prime minister who can simply throw me in jail if he happens to dislike what I say or how I pray, then I'm not actually going to have those liberal rights. Now, the second element, of course, is the democratic element. But we don't just want to have the rule of law and individual rights. We want to feel that we collectively can throw out the government if we don't like it. That there's not a monarch or a priest or an imam or an army general who tells us what to do, but that we together, through our political institutions, make the laws. That's the democratic element of our political system. So populists are dangerous to liberal democracy, to our democratic republic, because they undermine each of these values. They start by undermining the liberal value, the value of individual freedom and individual rights. They don't tend to respect it for various minority groups. And then they start to say, if you disagree with me, you're a traitor. If you disagree with me, you're an enemy of the people. And so therefore, I'm going to try and put my own loyalists into the law enforcement agencies, into the Electoral Commission, into the courts. Because since I alone speak for the people, it can't be legitimate that a prosecutor determines what kind of length of punishment to ask for independently of me. I'm the prime minister, I'm the president, I get to decide these kinds of things. Since I alone speak for the people, it's illegitimate that a court might overrule a decision that I've taken, an executive order that I've made. They should fall in line with the expression of the people's will. And if the current judges don't do that, then perhaps we should reform those courts or force existing judges to retire and so on and so forth. So that's why it undermines the liberal element of our political system. But once the Supreme Court is no longer independent, once the Electoral Commission has been captured by an authoritarian populist, once you no longer have independent institutions that aren't dependent on the political will of a prime minister or the president, it eventually ceases to be possible to throw a democratically elected government out through democratic means. And this is what I found when I was doing some reporting in Hungary last year. People were afraid to speak to, I was doing a BBC documentary, so I was there with a radio microphone. People were afraid to speak to me in the streets because they said they might lose their job tomorrow if they talked to me. The opposition had huge fines levied on them for spurious reasons, even though the governing party engaged in the same practices that they were being punished for. And so as a result, in Hungary, it is now no longer possible to remove the democratically elected government. And Orban was originally elected in a democratic way, but it's now no longer possible to remove him in a democratic manner. And Hungary is a particularly important case. Why? It's far away from here. It's a small country. Doesn't seem to be of particularly great importance relative to India, relative to some of the other countries that are facing similar developments. But it's particularly important because it's the case that really disproves the notions that political scientists have long believed in. Hungary has had about 5 changes of government with free and fair elections since 1990. It has a GDP per capita of over $14,000 a year. It is precisely the kind of country that was meant to have a consolidated democracy, that was meant to have a safe democracy, and yet at this point it is a semi-dictatorship. So what I want to do in this talk today is 2 things. First, to try and understand why it is that a lot of this is happening around the world at the moment, to think a little bit about the causes of these developments. And second, to think a little bit about some of the things that we might actually be able to do about it, some of the ways in which we might be able to respond. And then I'm really looking forward to some questions from the audience and a little bit of back and forth. Now, I understand that at this school you like to read the fundamental texts, the classics of social science and political theory and economic theory. So let me tell you a little story that comes from Bertrand Russell, one of the great philosophers of the past century. It's about a chicken on a farm. And every day the chicken wakes up and the sun is shining. It's a farm in Arizona, of course. And he's saying, I'm so happy with my life, you know. I'm well fed. Every day the farmer comes and mutters some encouraging words and gives me something to eat. What more could I wish for? And some of the other animals say, be careful, the farmer only seems nice. One day he's going to come and kill you. And the chick says, what are you talking about? This goes against all my experiences. Why on earth would he suddenly act so differently? But of course, one day the farmer does, as Bertrand Russell puts it, come to wring the chicken's neck, demonstrating that more sophisticated views as to the uniformity of causation would have been to the chicken's benefit. What's Russell trying to tell us with this story? Well, he's trying to tell us that sometimes there's scope conditions to how the social world works. That as long as the chicken was too thin to fetch a good price at the market, the farmer had a reason to keep feeding it. And once it was fat enough to be sent off to the market, the farmer had a good reason to slaughter and sell it. So we always have to think about what are the broader scope conditions that govern how things work in the social world. Now, I think we should ask the chicken question when assessing the past stability of democracy. What is it that was true in countries in North America and Western Europe for 50 or 60 years that made democracy relatively stable, and why is it that it's no longer stable anymore? What has changed so that those kind of scope conditions appear to have gone away? And it seems to me that there's at least 3 obvious candidates here, some of which are more present in certain places, some of which are a little bit more present in other places, but in one version or another, I think are operative everywhere. So the first has to do with economic developments. In the United States, from 1935 to 1960, the living standard of an average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, the living standard of an average American doubled. From 1985 to today, depending on who you listen to and which exact indicator of inflation you use, it has remained remarkably stagnant. Perhaps it's grown by 0%, perhaps it's grown by about 30%, but in any case, it is a lot less than in those previous periods. And that changes how people think about politics in a pretty fundamental way. It's not that they ever used to look at Washington, D.C. and say, that's the place of moral virtue. That's the place where wonderful people go in order to do great things for the nation. You would have gone to talk to somebody in 1970 or 1930, they wouldn't have believed that either. But they did used to think, you know what, in the end, I'm doing a lot better than my parents were. And my kids are going to do a lot better than me. So let's give them the benefit of a doubt. Something here seems to be working. Let's let them do their thing. And today, I think a lot of people say, I've worked hard all my life and I don't have much to show for it. My kids are probably going to be worse off than me. So let's try something new. Let's throw everything over a little bit. How bad could things get? This clearly isn't working. I'm not trusting those people. Now, it's not necessarily true that the people who end up voting for populists are less affluent than the people who don't end up voting for populists. But what is true is that they're concentrated in parts of a country that are doing far less well, that are far less affluent. So for example, when you look at the United States, counties in which Donald Trump won in 2016 are far less likely to have experienced a lot of economic growth, more likely to have jobs that might be lost to automation, less likely to have had recent economic investment, more likely to have higher default rates and mortgages, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily that people are saying, I'm one of the people who's been left behind. I have reason to be angry with my life. But it is people who are saying, I might still be doing okay, but I look around my neighborhood, I look the neighborhood, a couple of miles down the highway, and I'm starting to worry. My kids might be doing okay, but if they're going to have a good life, they probably have to leave this town. And I'm a little angry about that. Those are the people who are most likely to have reason to be dissatisfied with our economic system. Now, for the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a big debate about whether the causes of populism are more economic or whether more cultural. Are they more to do with stagnating living standards, or are they more to do with a backlash against growing diversity and so on? And I think that that's a false debate. It can be both of those things, and each of these factors can play a role in its own way. So let's talk about cultural and to some extent demographic change. In many democracies in the world, they were founded as monoethnic and monocultural. I was born in Germany, as I mentioned earlier. If you'd gone back into the streets of Bonn or Munich in 1960 and you'd asked people who is truly German, who really belongs in this country, they would have given you a relatively straightforward answer. They would have said, well, people whose grandparents and great-grandparents were already living, broadly speaking, in this part of the world, people who are white and Christian, people who we descend from in an ethnic sense. Now, over the last 50 or 60 years, Germany and many other European countries have experienced a lot of immigration. And thankfully, a lot of this kind of conception has started to change. I was looking at these polls recently, and actually, a lot of Germans now recognize that you can be German even if you have your roots outside of Germany, even if you're not a Christian, and so on and so forth. There's been some genuinely good movement on that front. But there's also a portion of a population that feels unsettled by those changes or that actively opposes it. And for I don't have much sympathy for that, for I'm squarely on the side of the people who embrace a more diverse and a more multi-ethnic understanding of what the German nation is today. I think it's important to try and understand it from a social scientific point of view. And the best way of trying to understand it is about social status. So I always try to think of somebody who lives in some small town in Germany who's perhaps not the most talented, not the richest, not the best looking guy in his town or village. And 30 or so years ago, he might have said, yeah, I'm no great shakes, I know that about myself, but at least I'm part of a dominant group. At least I'm a white, straight guy, and that gives me a certain kind of status and belonging in society. Well, and today, this guy might have a boss at work who's a woman. He might have somebody representing him in the Bundestag whose roots are in Turkey or some other country. And even though nothing has objectively been taken away from him, he feels that his social status has suffered from that the kind of unearned status advantage that he had in the past no longer accrues to him. And there's good social scientific evidence by Peter Hall and Noam Gidron and others to suggest that this really helps to predict who votes for populist parties and candidates. If you ask people to imagine society as a series of 10 steps, and you ask them, on which of those 10 steps were you 25 or 30 years ago? And they say, the 7th step. And when you ask them, on which of these steps do you find yourself today? And they say the 4th or the 5th step. If they feel like their social status has declined over those 25, 30 years, then they're particularly likely to vote for populist parties, and that holds in all kinds of different national contexts. Now, North America is different in one important respect, which is that this country has obviously always been multi-ethnic. But it's similar in the sense that one ethnic and religious group has always held a lot of advantages over other groups. And I think we shouldn't forget the extent to which we have made progress on that. And I think some people at the moment can be guilty of not taking that seriously enough. I think there's no question that it's better to be a member of just about any ethnic, religious, or sexual minority in the United States today than it would have been 60 or 40 or 20 years ago. And that's something we should stop to celebrate. But again, I think one of the impacts of that has been that there's a large group who says, well, hang on a second, I feel like my belonging and my status in the society is being called in doubt. I think some of the kind of position I had in society is no longer to be taken for granted, and they might be somewhat angry about that. Now, the third element, which is important as well, is about the rise of the internet and of social media. Now, whenever I think about social media, I think of a story that I stumbled across about a year ago, because it's just sort of so telling in a small way. There's a lady who lives somewhere in the United States in a suburb of a bigger town, and she's a vegan activist on Twitter. So she spends a lot of her time with quite a following trying to persuade other people to be vegan and explaining why she believes it to be immoral to consume meat and dairy and so on. And one day she's pulling into her driveway and she sees a little girl crying desperately next to her driveway. And she walks up to this girl and says, "Are you okay? What's going on?" She says, "Oh, no, it's nothing. It's just my friends all bought ice cream and I didn't have any money to buy ice cream, so I'm sad." And the ice cream truck is still standing there. And so this woman says, "Come, I'll buy you an ice cream." And they walk over to the ice cream truck and she buys this little girl an ice cream and she's very happy and she does, posts a cute post about this on Twitter. What do you think happens next? She's immediately denounced as a traitor to the vegan cause. What did the dairy industry pay you? How dare you spread this propaganda against veganism, right? And I think that tells us a lot about this political moment. It's a small little story, but in psychology, we know that people tend to be drawn towards other members of their group. And before our online world, we were part of much more politically heterogeneous groups. I'm sure that the opinions in this audience are not a perfect representation of the opinions in the US population as a whole, but there probably is some real disagreement about a bunch of important issues. And if you sit at your tables and you talk to each other, then if you're over here, you might be pulled a little bit in this direction. It's just a natural human tendency to do that. But online, if I'm over here, I'm just going to surround myself with people who have very, very similar points of views, who are all around here, and suddenly we egg each other on, and we radicalize each other, and we move over there. And that's not just true for one or two political directions. That's not just true for Republicans or for Democrats or whatever else, for libertarians or for socialists or conservatives. It's true for 100, 150, 200 different kinds of political causes, from veganism to everything else. And so it becomes very hard for political parties to actually represent those points of view in a way that people find acceptable, because they become quite tolerant of anybody who has slight disagreement, and any politician who's trying to somehow cobble together 50 of these groups is just going to find themselves going nuts, right? So that's one of the important impacts of social media. I think a broader way of putting it is that the distance between gatekeepers and everybody else in society has significantly been reduced. But it used to be the case that a relatively small number of people in a couple of cities in the country could decide what was part of our legitimate political discourse and what we should exclude from the political discourse because it was too extreme, or because it was a lie, or because it was inaccurate. And that's just no longer possible. If you have 50 or 75 followers on Twitter, and you put something that's viral enough, it starts to go around the world immediately, even if it is clearly untrue. I've been dealing with an example of that all this morning, by the way. So I woke up and I saw this poll that says that 38% of Americans would no longer buy Corona beer because of the coronavirus. Has anybody seen this poll? Spread like wildfire on Twitter. And it was written up, by the way, by some of the news outlets that we should have reason to trust as Americans. It was written up by CNN, that tries to be trusted by both sides, but if you're very progressive, then Vice News wrote it up for you, and if you're quite conservative, then the New York Post wrote it up for you. So people on all ends of a political spectrum bought into this at the media level. Well, it smelled a little fishy to me, because though it can be pleasing to look at our fellow citizens and think they must all be really stupid, I don't think that Americans are that stupid. That just didn't seem right to me. So I did a little bit of digging around, a little bit of research. And I found that this was basically fake news, that this is a PR agency that asked a whole bunch of questions about the coronavirus, such as, do you think that there's a connection between the beer Corona and the coronavirus? Would you no longer drink the beer because of the coronavirus? And they did not release any of those results. In fact, I kept ringing them and tweeting at them and emailing them, and they would not give the results to me. And so you look more carefully at that 38%, and what's that 38%? It's 38% of Americans who say they would not at this moment buy Corona beer for any number of reasons, such as not liking its taste. But this was written up by all of these different news outlets. It was written up by CNN. I'm not saying that was impossible. I'm sure that that happened occasionally 20 or 30 years ago as well. But I do think that social media and the way in which it can spread online, when suddenly news organizations are forced to follow suit, are forced to say, hey, hang on a second, there's this thing going around that's viral, we need to get a news story up about it immediately, has helped to create that effect. Now, that can be a good thing sometimes. I think there are some important voices on both sides of the political spectrum that were excluded from the conversation 25, 30 years ago, but are now starting to be part of our political conversation, and they might have something to add. But I do think it also makes it easier for some very hateful content, for some outright bigotry, and for some outright fake news, like this Corona beer poll, to shape our political system. And when you already have a moment when a lot of people feel like the political system isn't working very well because they're not getting ahead economically, and they're worried about a lot of the cultural or demographic changes that are going on, then the addition of it becoming so much easier for people to spread lies and incite hatred makes for a very dangerous cocktail. And you take those three reasons together, and I think that helps to explain the rise of populism around the world. All right, so now to the easiest part of the talk, what to do about this. I have all the perfect solutions. No, I don't. But I think that each of the causes that we've talked about implies a set of things that we might be able to do. So the first is the economic question. What do we do in order to make sure that people feel more confident in their economic future? And the first thing to say is that I don't think that we should entirely give up on our economic system, and I don't think that we should come to believe that the market is an immoral or inefficient way of running our economy. In fact, particularly people on the left, particularly people who say that they strongly care about the well-being and the fate of the poorest people around the world, should look at capitalism and be proud of its achievements for the last 20 years. Over the last 20 years, 2 billion people around the world have been raised from poverty to a modest middle-class life. Those are people who did not have stable access to electricity, who might not have been able to get an education, who did not have reliable running water or didn't know where we were going to eat every night, now living modest but humane and worthwhile lives. That is one of the biggest achievements in the history of humanity. And by the way, when you take the whole of the world population and run a Gini coefficient on them, you look at whether the world is now more or less equal, you find that the world has become more equal over the last 20 years because of the rapid growth of economies from India to China and beyond. So getting rid of capitalism is a non-starter. Having said that, I do think that there are real elements of our current economic system that aren't working. And they're not working because something's wrong with the market. They're not working because a lot of our politics is captured by special interests and so on. One of the obvious areas of this is tax havens. The amount of money that rich people and corporations hide, sometimes legally and sometimes illegally, in everywhere from Luxembourg to Bermuda to Ireland and so on. The fact that a lot of big corporations say, hey, all of our intellectual property is at home in this tiny little island nation, and all of the profits we make obviously come from intellectual property, so we don't have to pay any tax. A lot of it is perfectly legal, and it's clearly unjust. So that's something that we need to take on. I also think that there are ways to expand the welfare state without making our economies less dynamic. I think if people in their 20s know that they're going to have health insurance, it makes it easier rather than harder for them to be able to start a business, for example. And in fact, when you look at countries like Sweden, we now have higher rates of starting businesses than the United States does. I also think when you look at a topic like housing, that it's not a coincidence that housing is a lot cheaper in a place like the Phoenix metropolitan area than it is in some of the big cities on the east or the west coast, and that partially has to do with the fact that you have fewer building regulations here than you do in some of those other places, that it's easier to build new housing stock. So I don't think these solutions squarely fall on one or the other side of a political spectrum, but I think they amount to a coherent vision, which is to tell people that we're going to defend the market mechanism as one of the things that has brought great affluence to our country and to many countries around the world, but also that the political class finally has to take on all of the ways in which this system is currently set up in order to benefit a few people over the interests of the many. Now, the second set of things that I want to talk about is around culture and our story of who we are. I think there's a kind of cultural civil war going on at the moment in many countries, but perhaps especially in the United States, between people who are saying that there's nothing wrong with our country and we don't have anything to apologize for, and all of these people who are complaining are just ungrateful or unpatriotic, and we just need to troll them really hard until they go away. And people on the other side who are keenly aware of all of the injustices from which our country really does still suffer today, and are keenly aware of all of the deep injustices that have been perpetrated in the history of our country, but who don't want to see some of the things that are good in the country, and who don't want to see some of the ways in which we are actually collaborating as fellow citizens on an everyday basis. And so for me, the solution to some of those things is to create an inclusive patriotism or an inclusive nationalism in which we emphasize some of the things that we do share, in which we're honest about the injustices today and certainly the injustices in the past, but in which we also try to embark on a future in which we have a genuinely shared and common life. Now, as a German Jew, I'm now a proud American citizen, but as somebody who was born in Germany and who's Jewish, the idea of patriotism or nationalism does not come naturally to me. Certainly when I was 18, I had hopes that we should overcome any kind of form of collective identity like that for a more cosmopolitan outlook or an outlook in which people don't really care about their nations. But I've changed my mind about it. And the reason for that is twofold. It's first of all that in 2000 it was possible to fool yourself into thinking that nationalism as a political force was basically spent, that we could move beyond it. But today we see in virtually every country around the world that it probably is the most powerful political force that is out there. And that if those of us who are well-intentioned, if those of us who want to have more tolerant countries abandon the field of patriotism or nationalism altogether, it's going to be taken over by some of the worst kinds of people who want to weaponize it and instrumentalize it in the cause of bigotry and of exclusion. And secondly, I learned that when you think historically, patriotism and nationalism was often a force for good, that it was one of the things that allowed us to move beyond the local attachment of my family, of my village, of those people who share my exact religion, in order to come to have real solidarity with people who might be far away. It's one of the things that explains why it is that if there's a terrible hurricane in Boston or a terrible earthquake in Santa Barbara, sitting here in Phoenix, you're going to say, even if the person harmed by that might not look like me, might have a different religion, might live very far away from me, they're my fellow citizen and I owe them some kind of solidarity. I think that can be a very positive thing. But of course, our understanding of what that nation means needs to be inclusive. That is to say, it needs to say that everybody who actually is living here among us, everybody who is one of our fellow people making their lives in this country with us, has to be included under the story of us, irrespective of what their skin color is, irrespective of what their origin is, irrespective of what their religion is. And I think we have a higher, deeper basis for that than we sometimes like to think. I'm not entirely alone in academia in making an argument for inclusive patriotism or inclusive nationalism. It's a little lonely. Most people disagree with me. But even when people make this argument, they usually just make it on a civic basis. They usually just say, that's right, and it's about the Declaration of Independence, and it's about the Constitution. It's about being an American by virtue of us believing in those values. Now, I think if there's one thing that's obvious from my talk today, hopefully, it's that I also believe in those values, that I think they're really important, and that there should be an important civic aspect to our American patriotism. But I think that doesn't quite capture what American patriotism is today. I think when you talk to people why they feel American, why they feel proud to be American, and people from all walks of life and all origins, they might mention the Constitution at some point, they might mention the Declaration of Independence at some point. It's not going to be the first thing out of their mouth. And I think we underestimate the extent to which we do actually have a common American culture. And that common American culture is not a throwback to the Puritans in Massachusetts in the 18th century, and it's not a throwback to sort of people in suburbs in the 1950s cooking TV dinners. It's a lived and evolving American culture, but that's very shared. You can have grown up in Phoenix and lived here all your life, and if I airlift you into a bar and tell you to order a Corona, let's say, in a bar in Boston, you know what the cultural script is. You know how to talk to the bartender. You know when you're going to pay the drink. You know that you're supposed to give $1 as a tip. I take you to a pub in London, and if you've never been to England, you're a little lost. You don't know when to pay. You don't understand the banter of a bartender. It's a different culture. And I think when people are patriots for their country, it is because they have a special love of the culture of their place. And nations do have cultures in that way. Now, just as I might love New York City without therefore having to hate Los Angeles or Tokyo, I think you can love America in the civic sense, but also in this cultural sense, without therefore having to hate Canada or Mexico or Japan. The thing to understand about nationalism is that it's always potentially dangerous. I think of it as a half-domesticated animal, a half-domesticated beast that can always run wild. The worst kinds of people can get a hold of it and provoke it and stoke it until it runs wild. but it can also be a real force for good, a real force for solidarity with each other. And that's, I think, what we need to build if we want to calm some of those fears about cultural and demographic change, to make sure that all of us as Americans feel like we can be a part of this common story. Now, finally, the third element of this is the rise of the internet and of social media. And I see a lot of temptations, especially on the left, I have to say, but in some parts of the right as well, to say if there's all of this noxious, horrible things going on the internet and on social media, if all this false information can spread around, then perhaps what we have to do is to find stronger forms of censorship to make sure that people can't say those horrible things online. Now, I think that there's all kinds of ways in which we need to regulate social media companies. I think, for example, that if we entrust a company with your data and they promise to keep it private and then they don't treat it responsibly and somebody else gets access to it, they should have to pay very, very heavy fines. There's all kinds of ways in which we can regulate social media in ways that I'm absolutely in favor of. But I don't think that we should undermine the freedom of speech in that way. I don't think that governments particularly should step in order to limit what people can say. Now, there's all kinds of wonderful arguments that philosophers have made over the years for why we should have freedom of speech, for what some of the good things are that we get out of freedom of speech. And I imagine that in your undergraduate classes here, you assign and read things like John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which is a very important text to me. Mill argues that we might be wrong in what we believe, and we have to preserve freedom of speech in order to allow people to show us our errors. He also argues more cleverly that even if we are right about what we believe, it'll strengthen our beliefs in the right way to hear somebody argue for a different point of view, because it means we actually have to explain and defend our points of view rather than just taking it for granted. I think these are all wonderful arguments, but my reason for believing in freedom of speech is slightly different. It's not about the wonderful things that happen, that follow from freedom of speech. It's about the horrible things that follow when you don't have freedom of speech. It's a slightly different emphasis. Because I think two bad things happen. The first is that it's always remarkable to me that the people who are against freedom of speech assume that they're going to be the ones who are doing the censoring. That they simultaneously often argue that our country is a deeply unjust place in which all the worst people are in power. And then they say, therefore, the government should censor things. And you think, but what if some of those horrible people are in power? The second thing that I think is worrying in a democracy is that allowing for that kind of censorship really raises the stakes of electoral competition. It means that what's at stake in each election is not just having to suffer the rule of somebody you dislike for the next 4 years. It's giving that person the power to shut you up. And that, I think, makes the stakes at every election even more existential than they already seem to be, in a way that's only likely to incite conflict and dissension. And so if the solution isn't to ban what people can say, I think it comes much closer to doing some of the things that this conference does and some of the things that this school does, which is to proselytize the basic values of a democratic republic, the basic values of liberal democracy. The supply of noxious ideas is always going to be there. We have to make sure that the demand for it is less. Now, on that count, I'm actually quite optimistic. I know that this is not a great Friday evening talk. I feel like I have to press to all of you. But I'm going to try and leave you with a slightly optimistic thought at the end. And it's that people take for granted democracy. I always think of a story that David Foster Wallace told in his beautiful commencement speech, where he describes an old fish in the sea who's swimming, happily, and he runs into two young fish. And he says, "Oh, good morning, young fish. Good morning, young fish. How's the water?" And the young fish says, "What water?" They've been in the water all their lives. It doesn't occur to them that that's what they need to live and to survive. And I think you can start seeing a similar dynamic with people's attitudes to democracy. At the beginning, when these populists take over and they abolish independent institutions and they undermine the rule of law and all of those kinds of things, and a set of elites warn about this, often the old political class warns about it, it's very easy to say, who cares? This is just the wrong kind of people defending their self-interest. I don't see any bad impacts on that. My life is still the same as it always was. Why should I be worried about this? But the more these authoritarian populists actually consolidate their power, the more the space for freedom of speech gets constricted, the more they undermine the actual electoral process, the more this point about democracy starts to hit home. And I think we've seen that in the last years. We've seen it in Bolivia after Evo Morales tried to steal the election there, and people came out in the street to protest that. We saw it in Venezuela, where millions of people have been in the streets protesting the government of Nicolas Maduro. But we've always also seen it in a country like Turkey, where a little over a year ago now, there was a municipal election in the city of Istanbul in which the opposition narrowly was able to win. And the government decided to cancel that outcome of the election, while, by the way, not canceling the outcome of another election that was in the same ballot, because that one they'd won. And people got very angry about it. And when they re-ran the election, the opposition actually won by 10 percentage points. So I think once people actually see that some of those values are in real danger, once they actually start to notice in their daily lives what it means to live in a political system where you can't take individual freedom or collective self-determination for granted, they will stand up to fight for those things. At that point, the populists may be so entrenched that it's hard to displace them. And of course, in Bolivia, we have had a transition of power, but in Venezuela and in Turkey, we have not yet had a transition of power. So this story is only half optimistic. But if you ask me whether people still believe in the basic elements of our political system, whether they're still committed to individual freedom and collective self-determination, I would say they're a little asleep at the wheel. They've forgotten about the importance. But these values are as fundamental and as important to people in the 21st century as they were in the past. And that makes me optimistic that in the long run, we're going to be able to defend those values. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a microphone coming up. We have a good 20 minutes for questions from the audience. I will take the liberty of the chair's position to pose an opening question to you. Is it a thread running through your analysis that folks like the people in this room who think a lot about these questions, but who diverge in some, simply put terms, left and right, might at this moment of concern, maybe crisis, might want to themselves, as people who are in a way civic thinkers and civic leaders, emphasize what we fundamentally share, have in common, and not to disregard differences left and right, especially educators, but to say at this moment we need to come together and say we're not educating as well as we could, we're not emphasizing what we share in common about institutions and values and principles and education, and so we should pull together. It's not that those other differences don't matter, they do, but at this moment we need to do some refocusing on fundamentals, and especially these fundamental liberal democratic republic principles.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great summary of that. I don't believe that we should all have the same political opinions. I don't believe that we all need to be sort of political centrists or moderates who sort of, believe in exactly the same set of things. I think you can be a robust conservative and a robust liberal, now in a more political sense, and agree on some of the basic rules and norms and institutions we need in order to sustain our political system. For me, it's a matter of defining those rules, institutions, and norms, not because I think they're more important for some bizarre reason than other kinds of political values, but because they are the basis on which, if some of you are far to the left and some of you are far to the right, each of you can fight for these values as hard as you want to without raising the danger that we might come to blows, without raising the danger that we might end up with a dictator, or even worse, might end up in some kind of civil war. And so the point of these institutions is not that they're an end in themselves, is that they're what we need in order to allow us to argue strongly for the different kind of political positions we might have. Now, of course, this is easy in the abstract and harder to do in practice, which is to say that when you ask Americans, hey, and you can see this pattern in other countries as well, hey, do you believe in all of these different kinds of principles? Everybody says, yeah, of course. And when you ask them, do you believe that this particular person at this particular time is a danger to those principles? They all say no. Well, then it really depends on their partisan leaning, right? And if that person happens to align with a party ID and some of their ideology, then they say, no, of course not. And if a person is on the other side, then they say, yes, of course. Now look, let me be upfront with you. I think Donald Trump is a danger to the American Republic. I think that he has done a lot of very bad things. And I think that no matter how conservative you are, you should be worried about those things and oppose those things, because we should all care about those basic liberal democratic norms. Now, I'll also say that I have some conservative friends who I deeply admire because they have stood up for those norms and those institutions in ways that have been very professionally costly to them and personally costly to them. And that was a very courageous thing to do. I am a little bit more on the left, sort of center-lefty kind of broadly. I feel that if the, what's the expression? If a stone was on the other foot, if the foot was on the other stone, something like that. You know what I'm trying to say? If a shoe was on the other foot, thank you very much. I think some of my friends would fail the test. I think they would go along with somebody who's packing the Supreme Court in order to pass progressive policies. That's great because it's for a good cause. And I think that would be just as wrong, right? So I think it's something that we should all recognize as difficult, and we should all recognize as our civic duty, irrespective of which part of the political spectrum we fall into.
Brief questions from the microphone.
Hello, thank you for, oh my gosh, okay. Thank you for coming. My name is Sabrina Garland. I'm a student here. This is either me pushing back or just asking for clarification, depending on what your answer is.
It's asking for clarification.
Great. So on the example that you gave where the cohesion, the bonds that we would have with one another as Americans is not just ideals, it's culture. You gave the example of Phoenix and Boston. America's massive. There's 320 million people. You have people that have an experience living in rural Wyoming, those living in the South in Georgia, on the beaches of San Diego, et cetera. Completely different experiences of living. So is there just then a very, very minimum level of things that we have in common culturally that you're saying should tie us together? Or does then the common ideas come more into play in those situations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I've lived in a number of different countries, and I thought when I first moved abroad after growing up in Germany that would make me believe even more that we're all alike. And in one sense, that's of course true. I mean, most of my good friends at this point are not German, did not grow up in Germany, have become a US citizen. In many ways, I think all of the nice ideas about humans being humans where we're from are absolutely right, and more right than we sometimes want to recognize in this moment. But culturally, there are real differences, and they're bigger than I realized. Britain turned out to be culturally way more different from Germany. And in my first year at university, I had real trouble communicating with some of my friends, and I would end up offending them because we had different cultural scripts of how to talk about things. Now, America is a huge country, and it's a vast country, and it's a very diverse country in demographic terms, but also in many different ways. And no doubt there's real cultural differences within the country. I think that if you went to live abroad for a while, and perhaps you have, you would find that the similarities are slightly bigger than we sometimes give it credit for. And you can see that both in concrete terms, and in more abstract terms. I mean, one concrete way I think about is that you take a white working class guy 5 miles south of the US-Canadian border, say in Michigan, and you take a white working class guy 5 miles north of the Canadian-US border, let's say, I hope I'm getting this right, in Ontario, and it comes to the Olympics, and the American is gonna cheer for, an African American from Los Angeles, and the Canadian is gonna cheer for somebody with roots in Asia who grew up in Vancouver. So that's a very real thing, and objectively, these two people probably have more in common with each other in terms of their very particular local culture and the weather patterns and what the house looks like and all kinds of other things. But that sense of common identity still holds. And so I think that there is an American culture, which doesn't mean that every American is the same, but we share in a whole bunch of common cultural assumptions and backgrounds, even across this very, very diverse nation. And it's one of the things that makes people, in a natural way, patriotic about America, and that's a positive thing.
Thank you.
Much of your talk underlies a nominal assumption that kind of a lot of these kind of crux liberal values, especially some of them came off to me as particularly progressive liberal values, are good. So I must push back on the general notion, which is, why should one be so inclusive? What incentive is there for societies to be ever increasingly more inclusive? The notion of inclusivity to me seems ever painfully to lead to not greater inclusion, but cultural erosion in many cases. And furthermore, on your notion of kind of dictatorialism, in part that's also fueled by concerns over the maintenance of traditional society. It is painfully obvious that in many kind of modern liberal democracies that we are in fact semi-kleptocratic and oligarchic in nature. So thus it leaves many voters feeling the choice of either oligarchic democracy with through global capitalism, or the maintenance of traditional society at the cost of dictatorship. Your response?
All right. Well, I mean, first of all, I think if you
test the easy questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, first of all, I think if you look at some dictatorships around the world, it's not at all clear to me that that trade-off should be appealing even to you. I mean, it's not clear to me that dictatorships are actually particularly good in maintaining traditionalism, and certainly they're not particularly good in terms of avoiding corruption, in terms of avoiding extreme forms of kleptocracy, which are present in virtually every dictatorship in the world, in terms of giving people a decent standard of living, or any of the other vast sets of things that we might happen to care about. And when you talk about traditionalist values, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but one of them might be religious freedom. Well, it turns out that in many dictatorships, being religious was not allowed at all, and that religious people were deeply persecuted. So that's to your second half of the question. In terms of your first half of the question, I want to draw a distinction, which is that I think every country has a right to decide who should be coming into the country. Now, I don't think that they should be deciding that on the basis of race or religion, but it's perfectly appropriate for countries to say who should come and be a member in the society, under what circumstances are they allowed to come in, what should our immigration laws look like. In fact, I sometimes argue with my friends on the left to say, I think it's helpful to show people that we have real control over who comes in, and then make the argument why it makes sense for a good number of people to come in. I think once they have a sense that there is a real sense of control over the border, it's much easier to win the argument that immigration has brought many very good things to the United States. But we can absolutely debate that. If you want to have less immigration, I think that's a legitimate point of view to have. We don't agree, but that's fine. Now, what I think is both normatively we have a strong disagreement about, and I think just empirically is unclear to me what that would look like, is when you're talking about inclusivity in terms of people who already are living in this country, and especially people who are already citizens. We live in deeply diverse countries, and that's true in the United States. It's also true in countries like Germany or Italy or Sweden, where that didn't used to be the case. So how do we treat our fellow citizens? Do we want to expel them? Do we want to somehow get rid of them in some imaginary way? Do we want to have a two-class or two-caste society where forevermore there's the one dominant group that has full rights when everybody else who's mistreated in a systematic way. I don't think either of those things would be at all normatively appealing, and they certainly wouldn't be according with what we traditionally have claimed our values are. And so I think the only sensible answer, the only acceptable answer can be that we do want to be inclusive in those ways, that everybody who already lives in our societies should have an equal stake and equal opportunities in them. And that's why I talk about an inclusive patriotism.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
I've got a slightly shorter question for you.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it.
So on the topic of nationalism, which has been widely discussed today, I really liked your definition of a half-domesticated beast. So what are some of the red flags, if you will, that should arise when someone either weaponizes nationalism or nationalism becomes dangerous? So as someone who's civically engaged, what should I watch out for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's a couple of things, right? One, nationalism is a form of what moral philosophers would call partial affinity. It's an argument for saying that it's acceptable in certain contexts to have a special concern for people who fall in one group relative to the other. And there seems to be something sort of troubling about that. But there's another context in which that's perfectly natural to us. I'm not married, but if I decided to get married, part of that would be that I'm promising to love my spouse, my wife, over all others. That I give more consideration to her and that I have a deeper loyalty to her than I would to other people in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to go around thinking all other women in the world are terrible. It just means that I have a special devotion to my wife, right? And I think there's something similar when we talk about this kind of partial affinity with a nation. I think there's nothing wrong with saying you're an American, you particularly love America, and when there's something terrible that's happened in Boston or in LA, you're going to have a special set of solidarity with people there. Now, when people start to convince you that because you're American, you have to look down on Canada or you have to hate China, then we know that you're in trouble. That's a bad kind of nationalism. So that's one kind of condition. I think the other condition that I would mention is that, again, because I sort of love my wife, doesn't mean that I can't have friendships with other women or that I can't work very well with women in the workplace and all kinds of other things, right? The fact that you have a special devotion to one person doesn't mean you can't cooperate with others. And I think this is another form in which certain forms of nationalism that we see quite prominently at the moment run afoul. I think that there's all kinds of ways across the world in which we can cooperate with other nations in ways that are not zero-sum, in ways that leave us better off and leave them better off. But I think there's forms of nationalism that say any engagement with other nations has to be zero-sum, right? We only win if they lose. And that's, I think, again, a dangerous form of nationalism.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Try to keep mine short, but I had a slight diversion, what you said towards the end of it, because I wrote my question towards the beginning of it. But based off just the title of this presentation, do you think that it's always and only the responsibility of the people of a non-democratic state who want to become a democratic state to stand for their own liberal values, even if their government is oppressing them with that? So I wrote this in the context of thinking about the Balkans specifically. And then, as I mentioned, like the slight digression that you mentioned at the end was that if it is, say, like the United States' responsibility to help build these democratic institutions, how do you rectify a governmental reverence for liberalism with the people's lack of adherence to, or at least recognition of democratic values?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Now, look, I think that sometimes we can sort of run ourselves in weird circles around there, where we sort of say, it's evil if we sit in judgment of the system of government in other countries. And so if there's a terrible dictator in another country, we don't get to sit in judgment of them because that would just be ethnocentric or Western-centric or something like that. But that in itself is a very ethnocentric or Western-centric judgment, because we are assuming that how we act is really important in this kind of universal way. Right? So there's a sort of odd internal contradiction in some of those arguments. Now, for me, I think sovereignty is important. I think other countries' ability to govern themselves is important. And I think we've often been naive historically, and particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, about what the United States and other Western countries can do in order to bring democracy to other nations. And we have to be very, very careful about how we do that, certainly by force, but also in other ways. I also think, however, that there are lots and lots of dictators around the world who are suppressing the people in horrific ways and who don't have any legitimacy. I don't give one piece of legitimacy to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and I don't give one piece of legitimacy to Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Now, I don't think it follows from that we should go and march in and overthrow the government. There's all kinds of good practical and moral reasons why that's likely to be a bad idea. But sure, if I could switch a button and ensure that people in North Korea can elect a free government and stop being subject to the terrible dictatorship they're suffering, of course I think we should do that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for being here. I read your book last year, The People versus Democracy, and one of the things you talk about in the book is one of the driving forces of populism is this kind of cynicism of my vote doesn't matter, it's all rigged anyway. You know, a lot of people feel that way, and the Knight Foundation report about non-voters kind of confirmed that. And I think that sense kind of drives people to vote for people with anti-democratic tendencies, people who, you know, come out and say everything's rigged, so vote for me and I'll blow it all up. But if what you were saying at the beginning is true, and an anti-democratic changes are kind of a one-way street, or this ratchet that you can't undo, that's the opposite of the democratic consolidation that people used to think was around, then where does that kind of leave us? If people, on the one hand, people don't want to defend a system that they don't feel like is working for them, but then they don't realize the good parts of it until it's already too late. You know, if we have an Orban type of situation in this country, what do you do at that point?
Yeah. Well, I think that what you end up doing is empowering a lot of these populists for a long time until it hits a real crisis. So I was sort of hinting at this a little bit earlier. You know, when you look at the classic Latin American dictatorships of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, they had one thing going for them, only one thing, but one thing going for them was that they were relatively honest in what they told the people, at least at first. They drove up in tanks in front of a parliament building, got out their guns, often they shot the person who's legitimately elected, said, now we're in charge. And forget about your democracy, that wasn't working anyway, we're going to give you economic growth and the rule of law, and that's a worthwhile trade-off. There's something honest about that. They weren't pretending to be Democrats, right? Now, a lot of the time they, of course, failed to live up to that bargain in pretty clear and extreme ways. They were just as corrupt or even more corrupt. They were often just as chaotic, and they violated people's rights in very deep ways. But it's striking that populists stake the rule from the beginning on a kind of lie. They stake the rule on saying, this system is not democratic at all, and I'm going to make it more democratic. I'm going to give power back to the people. Now, I think that's what makes them so dangerous, because it doesn't take people saying, I don't care about democracy, take it away from me, I'm happy, in order to get there, right? So that's what makes it so powerful as a way of subverting a democratic system. But it does also potentially contain the seeds of its own destruction, because eventually people realize you haven't given power back to the people. This place is more corrupt than it was before. I feel that the elite is actually less responsive to me than it was earlier. And at that point, people tend to rebel. Now, what will happen at that point, we'll see. In some countries, like in Bolivia, I think they have managed to get rid of a government. Whether they'll manage to have free and fair elections is not yet clear, but hopefully they will. In other countries, like Venezuela, the dictator had enough support among the military that he was just able to shoot people down. So I think we'll see sort of how many cases fall in one category and how many cases fall in another category. In the long run, I think people will rebel against this kind of oppression, and the values of freedom and democracy will come to right again. But that might be a very long run, and it might be a very bloody long run. So it would be better to go and defend these values now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We're right at our time limit, so 2 brief questions, 2 brief answers, if you would mind, Yascha.
All right.
All right, I'm just going to say, I'm going to shorten so that I can, abbreviate it. I love your idea of inclusive patriotism. I think it's great that we're at a school that values flawed individuals rising to the occasion and doing great things like our founding fathers. I'm curious though about how you would suggest building up support for global ideas that need to happen. So getting all these different countries to come together on issues like climate change or protecting refugees, if they're really global issues rather than something that's just specific to that locality.
Yeah, and I would say that these are not in competition with each other. So when I'm in Europe, people often say, okay, look, you're in favor of an inclusive patriotism, but aren't we trying to build a European identity? And isn't it much better to be Europeans rather than Germans or Italians or wherever I happen to be? And my answer is always, look, if you tell people that you can have an identity as somebody who's from Munich, an identity as somebody who's from who's Bavarian therefore, and also a strong identity as somebody who's German, and on top of that you say, and you should have a real identity as a European, you might be able to win that fight. If you tell people to make a choice between being German and being European, they're going to choose to be German, and the European thing is definitely going to fall by the wayside. And I think that's a similar thing here. I think if you find solutions to these things where people have a sense that they're secure in their national belonging and they're secure in the identity that it gives them, and by the way, the United States should definitely cooperate with 190 countries around the world who've signed up to the damn Paris Agreement in order to make sure that we actually deal with this danger to humanity in a way that's not going to destroy our way of life, it's not going to destroy our economy, and that'll ensure that we keep getting more affluent in the future. I think that's a much easier sell than if you tell them the only way to deal with climate change is to get rid of capitalism, never feel American again, get rid of all your local affiliations. Then they say, well, you know what, perhaps I'll take my risk with capitalism, with climate change.
Gotcha, thank you.
Thanks.
Also as rapid fire as I can. So I find that there's this tension between intolerance and freedom of speech, and then further intolerance that comes from intolerance. And what I'll kind of say by that is if you have an original intolerance, that is to say something based on someone's identity, whether that's anti-Semitism, homophobia, racism, things like that, and you see people wanting to respond and limit those forms of speech because they perceive that those ideas hold a threat to a liberal democracy because these are ideas that have killed. How do you balance that tension between the liberal value of free speech and also the liberal toleration for people as they exist?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Look, I think that we need to expand. So one way of putting this is sort of the old paradox of should we be tolerant towards the intolerant, right? And my answer is, insofar as that is practically feasible, yes. At the moment at which they actually endanger the lives and the rights of the people who are tolerant, no. Which is to say that I think of our political system as drawing the largest tent possible and saying we invite everybody in and we try to deal with each other. And I guarantee you, you can worship as you want, you can live as you want, and I can do the same thing. And that way we both hopefully get to pursue what we think is important in our world. Liberals, in the philosophical sense, it's not that we give people freedom of choice because we think choice is so important. It's because we recognize how important it is to people to be able to live their religion as they see right, to lead their lives as they see right? It comes out of a respect for all of those values that we insist on this kind of freedom. Now, of course, there's some people who can't be included in the scheme of operation, because if somebody is coming in saying, I'm so offended by what you do that I'm going to come and shoot you, well, then we've got to defend ourselves, right? So if it's just people posting terrible things on the internet, if it's just people being assholes, we have to put up with that. That's part of the price of expanding the circle of freedom as far as we can. But of course, if there's people who come in and they want to destroy our political system, there's people who come in and they want to kill some of the people because they don't like who they are or how they worship or who they go to bed with, well, then we need to make sure that we lock them up so that they can't do any harm to us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, with that, we thank Yascha Mounk for a great conclusion to a great detail.
Thank you. That's fun.
Terrific.
Thanks.